Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching Installing Windows Server 2008 R2 and Active Directory. Now in this lesson, we're going to mix things up a little bit from the previous couple lessons. In the last couple lessons, we did a lot of talking, a lot of learning about different concepts and things like that. Never really got to go in and see anything or touch anything. Well, in this lesson, we're going to reverse that. We're not going to talk much at all in the way of concepts, and we're going to get right in and see how this stuff is installed. So to get things started, we're going to take a look at GlobalMantic and see how they're going to install Active Directory. And then we're going to go right into the operating system, or really, I shouldn't even say an operating system because we're going to go right into a computer which has nothing on it and install the operating system. We're going to install Windows Server 2008 R2. And then we're going to go ahead and install the Forest Root domain controller for the GlobalMantic network. And then we're going to follow that up by installing a replica domain controller to give some fault tolerance and redundancy to their network. So to get things started here, GlobalMantic has decided to go forward with the implementation of a Windows Server 2008 R2 Active Directory infrastructure. Now since the corporate offices are in New York, that's where we're going to create the Forest Root domain. And the name of this domain is going to be globalmantic.local. Now the reason we're going to use that name is because we wanted to go ahead and stick with a name that makes sense to the company. In other words, the name of the company is GlobalMantic, so that's where the GlobalMantic portion of this name comes from. But we want to have some separation from GlobalMantic's external facing web presence, okay, which that is globalmantic.com. And the reason we want to do that is, well, one reason is for security. GlobalMantic.local, or I could even just say .local, is not valid on the internet. Okay, that's not a valid internet name. So it's a little bit more difficult to gain access to the internal Active Directory infrastructure if we're not going to use a name that is recognized out on the internet. The other reason is because it will give separation to give a little bit of clarification and maybe ease some confusion with the internal users between certain servers which will be globalmantic.com and other servers which will be globalmantic.local. The users will know that anything that is globalmantic.com is part of the external facing web presence, or we could say the web servers basically for the company, and globalmantic.local is everything that has to do with the Active Directory infrastructure. So that's pretty much what GlobalMantic has decided to do. And here I have a diagram of exactly how GlobalMantic is made up. As far as in New York, we have 500 people. In Chicago, we have 75. Dallas, we just have 10. Remember, that's just a small remote office so that the owner could live in his hometown. And then we have our Asian office out in Tokyo where we have 50 clients. Now, I don't want you to get all caught up in all the rest of the specifics because right now we're just going to stay focused on New York, the corporate headquarters. This is where we're going to start everything. And as we go through the course, little by little, we will add some of the rest of the GlobalMantic network. All right, so the first step to installing Active Directory is you have to have a Windows Server operating system. And again, in this case, we're going to go with Windows Server 2008 R2. So on the screen, I have some steps listed that you have to go through when installing Windows Server 2008 R2. Now you don't need to worry about memorizing these steps, and as you possibly already know if you've ever installed Windows Server 2008 before, it's a fairly simple process. But I wanted to go ahead and have these steps listed for you, and included with this course we give you a PDF document of all of these screenshots. So feel free to print them out and have this in front of you if you want to have a step-by-step guide as you're following along. But basically, what do we have here? Step 1, verify that you meet the minimum hardware requirements. And I have here a link to Microsoft's website where they list these requirements. So let me go ahead and click on that link now. And this will take us to Microsoft's website where they list the minimum system requirements. Now, I don't really want to spend any time on this, and I don't want you to get caught up on this because pretty much almost all of today's computers are going to meet these system requirements. I mean, unless you have a pretty old computer, which, by the way, I don't recommend that you use that computer as, well, any domain controller, but definitely not the Forest Root domain controller. But you'll see here that you only have to have a 1.4 gigahertz processor, half a gig of RAM, 32 gig of hard drive space, and a standard monitor, DVD, keyboard, mouse, etc. The only thing here that I will point out that is of any significance is right here that you have to have an x64 processor. And that's because Windows Server 2008 R2 only comes with a 64-bit option. If you don't have a computer that supports 64-bit operating systems, then all you have to do is go back to Windows Server 2008 pre-R2. Okay, go with the regular Windows Server 2008. There is a 32-bit version there, and most of everything we're going to cover will still be the same. There are some small enhancements, some differences that you'll see with R2, but for the most part, you can still follow along. All right, so let me go ahead and close out of here and get us back over to our task list. After we've verified that our computer meets our minimum hardware requirements, we're going to need to boot from the installation media. So I'm going to put in a Windows Server 2008 R2 DVD. When we boot from that media, it will take us into an installation wizard, which will prompt us to select an installation language. From there, look at step 4. This is about as easy as you can get. Click to install now. Yep, there's actually a button that says install now. Now from there, the next step is you'll be prompted for a product ID. And I have it listed here if you have one. If you don't have one, that's okay, because what Microsoft has done is they've made it that it's the same media if you purchase the operating system as if you are using the evaluation copy. Okay, so if you don't have a product ID, no problem. You'll be prompted for it later. And if you still don't have one, well, then you'll be able to go ahead and use the product during the evaluation trial period. The next thing we'll be asked for is to select a version of the operating system. So we need to decide whether we want standard or enterprise or data center or web edition, okay, depending on what version we have. We'll need to check a box saying we accept the license terms. We will then need to choose custom or upgrade, and in this case it'll have to be custom because this is a blank machine. We're not upgrading. We'll talk a little bit about upgrading later on in this course. We then need to select and or format a hard drive or partition. And then from there, we sit back and relax and just let the installation happen. There's not a lot to this installation anymore. Uh-oh, there's a part 2. Don't worry, part 2 is not really that big a deal either. This is really kind of a post-installation task more so than the actual installation. The installation should be complete once you wait out all of the different steps and the reboots and things like that. And then you will be prompted to create or change the administrator password, and I'll show you that when we get there. And then you need to go through and complete the initial configuration tasks, which again is a utility that'll pop on the screen automatically. What are some of these tasks? Things like setting your time zone, configuring networking, like giving it an IP address, giving it a computer name, deciding whether you want to enable automatic updates and or feedback, downloading and installing the latest updates, always a very good idea. And I will tell you, there are some additional steps that I'm skipping here because we're going to do them outside of the initial configuration task utility. But a couple extras that we're going to have here are enabling remote desktop and configuring Windows Firewall. So these are all the things that we're about to do. So what do you say we go ahead and get started? All right, so I'm going to take us over to a computer that has just nothing on it. It's just a blank, brand new computer with the Windows Server 2008 R2 DVD in the drive, and we're just going to boot right into it and see what happens. Let's go now. Okay, so just to let you know exactly what you are looking at, I don't really feel like having a room full of computers here as we go through and build the Global Mantics network, right? Because this is a network for an entire enterprise, and I'm trying to emulate it right here in one room. And I don't want to have to do that with a whole bunch of different computers. So what I'm doing is I'm using virtualization. Now, if you're following along, you are welcome to use actual physical computers, or you can go ahead and use virtualization as well. There is no one steadfast rule that has to be followed. Along those same lines, if you're thinking, well, okay, virtualization, what virtualization product should I use? Again, it really doesn't matter. I happen to be using VMware Workstation, but if you are using Hyper-V or Virtual PC, or maybe you get more fancy with VMware, have some kind of an ESX server or something like that, it really doesn't matter. Okay, but I wanted you to know that what we're looking at here is a virtual machine that I've created, which is going to have Windows Server 2008 R2 with the 64-bit operating system. It doesn't have that yet. That's you're prompted to tell it what operating system you're going to install. But right now it's just a blank machine. And I want you to notice that I have 1 gig of RAM, which is more than the half a gig requirement. I have an 80 gig hard drive, which by today's standards is extremely small, but again, comfortably enough for what we're about to go through. I am pointing to an ISO file, okay, which is a DVD file that virtualization can use to emulate as though I've put the DVD in the drive. And here's a setting also with the network adapter. I have it set to bridged, and what that means is this particular virtual machine will be able to communicate outside with other virtual machines as well as with the internet and with the host machine, and pretty much it can communicate with the entire network. Okay, which is very important because as we create multiple virtual machines, they need to be able to talk to each other. So those are the significant settings that we have on this virtual machine. Now I'm going to go ahead and power on this machine, and I'm going to tell you it might flash a little bit here. I don't want you to get distracted by it because it's going to try to work with different resolutions. And so you're going to see the window get bigger and smaller and things like that. I'll try to keep it as consistent as possible for you. So let's go ahead and turn on this virtual machine. And you'll see here that it immediately, because there is no operating system, it's just a blank machine, it goes right into Windows is loading files and then launching the installation wizard. Now, if this was a computer that already had something on it, if it already had an operating system on it, and I had put in the Windows Server 2008 DVD, I would have been given a message up near the top that would have said press any key to boot from CD or DVD, because the system wouldn't have known whether it wanted to boot from the DVD or boot from the original operating system. Okay, so just so you know, if you have that scenario happening in front of you, that's why that's happening. So here we go. Here is that first step that I was talking about, where you need to go ahead and select an installation language. And since I speak English and I'm here in the United States, I'm going to go ahead and leave it as English and US. Go ahead and click Next. And then here is that Install Now button that I made reference to. So I'm going to go ahead and click that. And you'll see here that now is when it truly takes you in to the installation wizard. Okay, so the next step that we have here, and by the way, I should mention, on my system, I didn't get prompted for that product ID that I said we would be prompted with, and that's because I'm using a volume license edition, so it doesn't prompt you. So you may have had one extra screen depending on exactly which version of Windows Server 2008 you're using. But here is where we go ahead and select which version we want, whether we want standard, enterprise, data center, or web server, and whether we want the full installation or the server core installation. Now, for right now, we're going to deal with full installations only. I'll talk to you about server core later on in this course. So what we need to decide is, well, do we want standard, enterprise, data center, or web server? Well, the one that I know we don't want is web server. And the reason why is because you can't install Active Directory on the web server edition. So now I need to choose between standard, enterprise, and data center. And here's what I'll tell you. Standard edition is primarily designed for a single server type environment, not for your larger enterprise environment. I mean, you'll probably never guess which version is designed for the larger enterprise environment. Hey, that's right, Enterprise Edition. Yeah, so we don't want standard because that's kind of more for your small business, single server type environment. It's not that we couldn't use it, it's just not what it's designed for. Now, on the opposite end, we have Data Center. Data Center Edition is designed for your large data centers, your large data warehousing, which again is not what we're doing here. So the decision that we're going to make is to install Windows Server 2008 R2 Enterprise full installation. And again, you'll notice the only choices I have all include the x64 architecture, the 64-bit architecture. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Next. I have to check the box to accept the license terms. By all means, feel free to go through and read the license agreement if you've never done so before. I have, so I'll go ahead and say yes, I agree to those terms and click Next. And this is where we now choose between an upgrade or a custom installation. Now I can't do an upgrade. Well, there's two reasons. One, because I booted off of the DVD, and if I were to select upgrade, it would tell me that this is something you should do from within your existing operating system. But the second reason I can't upgrade, and this is kind of the probably the most important reason, is, well, there's nothing to upgrade from. I don't have anything on this computer right now. Now, as I mentioned before, we'll talk about upgrading later on in this course. But for right now, we're going to select Custom to install a new copy of Windows. So I'll click on that now. Next, I need to choose what disk I want to go ahead and install the operating system on. And then from there, if I wanted to, I could click on Drive Options. And I could go in here and I could choose to format, okay, or I could even from there create different partitions out of this one drive. But I don't need to do any of that, okay? I don't need to select a new partition or anything like that. I'm just going to go ahead and select disk 0 with the 80 gig drive. There's nothing which is incenting me to want to partition this. And because it's a clean computer, I don't have to worry about overwriting anything that might already be in place. So I'm going to go ahead and click Next. And then this is where we get to sit back and relax. It says right here, that's all the information we need right now. Your computer will restart several times during the installation. Yeah, so basically it's going to go through and it's going to copy Windows files. You'll see that's already done. It'll expand the Windows files. This part probably takes longer than anything else in the installation. Then it's going to go through and install features, updates, and complete the installation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording of this lesson. And if you're following along with me, please pause the lesson as well. And I will be back with you and I will resume the recording of this lesson as soon as we are done with all of these steps and the reboots, etc., etc. So I will be back with you the next time it is prompting me to actually do something. So I'll see you in just a moment. Okay, so a little bit of time has passed. We've gone through all the different steps and the reboots. I will mention, by the way, the computer that I'm running on, I would say about 10-15 minutes have passed. If you're trying to gauge how long it should be taking, some computers, I've seen them take as long as 30 minutes, 40 minutes. Shouldn't be taking much longer than that. If it is, you may want to check those minimum hardware requirements. You may be right on the very, very bottom of them or not meeting them at all. But anyway, this is the screen that it takes you to after it's done installing the operating system. And this is where it says the user's password must be changed before logging on the first time. Now you may remember that I had mentioned that we were going to create/change the password. And the reason why is it gets a little confusing. Here it says changed, and I'm going to click OK. And then here you're essentially it says new password, so again it's like you're changing, but we don't have a password. See, the default password for administrator is just blank. That's what it creates by default. So technically we're changing it, But I've had some people who have been confused and said, well, I don't really know why it says I'm changing the password. I haven't established one. This is where we're establishing it kind of for the first time. But anyway, let's go ahead and put in a password. And I have my own secret, super secure password that I like to do. And so I'm going to go ahead and enter that in twice here, right? You have to enter it and then confirm it to make sure, since you can't see the password, you just see dots, make sure you're typing it in correctly. Because if you just typed it in once and you had a typo, you'd never get to log in again, right? So go ahead and type in a password that is nice and long and secure that you want to use for the administrator account. And then we're going to go ahead and click this arrow, or you could just hit enter, either way. And you'll see here it says changing the password. Your password has been changed. And again, it's changing from blank to the password you just created. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now it's going to take just a moment while it brings us to the desktop for the very first time. And the desktop it's going to bring us to when it's logging in here is for the built-in local administrator account. Okay, because basically that's the only account that exists right now. Okay, technically there's two accounts. There's administrator and guest. But administrator is the only account that's actually active. So here it has logged us into the desktop. But again, I'm gonna hold on for just a minute here. I'm not going to click on anything. I'm not going to move because I want you to notice that the very first time it logs in, it's going to take us to that initial configuration task utility. And here it is as I'm saying it. So you'll see here, initial configuration tasks. And I have to tell you, there is one step, I have to apologize, on the screen where we were going through all the different steps. The one I left off was activating Windows. We went right to setting the time zone. So one step we could do is to activate Windows. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to try it. I'm going to go ahead and click on Activate Windows. So this is where it's now going to prompt me for my product key since it didn't do it during the installation process. And again, it has to do with the fact that this is a volume license copy. So I'm going to go ahead and enter my key in now. And then I'm going to go ahead and click on Next. And you'll see here that it is going to attempt to activate Windows. And the reason I'm saying attempt and that we'll try this is because although I have set up for this computer to have bridged networking capabilities, which means I should have internet connectivity, I haven't actually set up networking yet specific. So I'm hoping that the router that I have on my network, which does hand out IP addresses via DHCP, will give this server an IP address and it will be able to get to the internet. And as you can see here, apparently it did because activation was successful. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Close. And now let's go down through the tasks here. We're going to set the time zone. And here we're going to go ahead and select time zone and change this to the Eastern time zone, USA and Canada. And that's because this is in the New York office for GlobalMantics, which is in the Eastern time zone. Click OK. And everything else here we can leave alone. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Next, we need to configure networking. So I'm going to click on that link. Now, we know that networking is working to some degree, right? Because we got out to the internet. But it's not necessarily set up the way we would want to have it for the GlobalMantics network. So here we have our local area connection, which I'm going to right-click and go to Properties. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to uncheck the box for Internet Protocol version 6 or TCP/IP version 6. And that's because we are not going to be doing anything in this course that has to do with IP version 6. Everything we're going to do is with IP version 4. So I'm just going to go ahead and uncheck the box so that it doesn't get in the way. And then I'm going to highlight IP version 4. And be careful, by the way, not to click on the checkbox because that'll make it go away. You want to click on the name itself to highlight it. Click Properties. And you'll see here, by default, we're obtaining an IP address automatically, where I got it from the DHCP server. I want to use a static IP address, and this is very important if you're going to be a domain controller. If you are ever going to be a computer, or I could even say, probably to be more specific, a server, which is going to provide any kind of a significant service to your network, you probably don't want to be a moving target. Okay, but when you have the button selected to obtain an IP address automatically, you may not always keep the same IP address. And that's not a good thing because clients need to know where you are. And so once they learn what your IP address is and where you are, they want to be able to count on that. So we're going to use a static IP address, and the IP address that I'm going to use here is 192.168.10.201. Now, you don't have to use that exact IP address if you're following along. Okay? I'm using this IP address because my network in the room that I'm in, the subnet that I'm on that is able to go through the router and get to the internet is the 192.168.10 network. And I know based upon the way the rest of my network is set up here that 201 is an IP address that is not used by anything else and can be used by this forest root domain controller. So I'm going to go ahead and hit tab, and you'll see that it populates the subnet mask for me, and that's fine. That's the subnet mask I am looking for. That puts me on the 192.168.10 network. Come down here to default gateway, and I'm going to put in 192.168.10.1 because that happens to be the IP address of the router that's getting me out to the internet. I should mention at this point, by the way, if you don't have a router and access to the internet, you don't need it. The only thing you won't be able to do is you won't be able to activate, which I already did. And if you couldn't activate, that's fine. You just work with the evaluation copy. And the other thing you won't be able to do is you won't be able to install updates, which, although that's not recommended from a security point of view, right? You want to have all the latest and greatest security updates. If you're not going to be on the internet, if you're in a secure environment that doesn't access the outside world, well, then you're okay there as well. Okay, so I don't want you to freak out if you don't have or you don't know how to put this out on the internet at this moment. Okay, so here I have an IP address, subnet mask, default gateway, and then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to choose to point to the same IP address, 192.168.10.1, as my preferred DNS server. Now, I should mention, this is going to change. Okay, this is where I'm pointing right now because in order for me to maintain internet access, I need to also have DNS to be able to do name resolution on the internet, and I don't have a DNS server on my network other than that router. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and for right now leave it there, but again, that's going to change, and I'll show you that when we get a little bit further into this lesson. So I'm going to click OK and close, and then close my network connections window. Now my networking has been configured. The next thing I need to do is provide a computer name and domain. Now you may have noticed that when I listed the steps for you originally, when we were looking at the steps in the slides, I only said computer name. And that's because there is no domain yet to join. So all we're going to do is go ahead, and you'll notice we have this random computer name that it gave us, and we're part of a work group. Well, I'm going to go ahead and click change, and we're going to give this a computer name, and the computer name is going to be New York DC1 2K8. Okay, that's the naming convention that I'm going to use here. This tells me it's in the New York office. This is my first domain controller, and it's running Windows Server 2008. And again, there is no domain to make it a member of, so all we have to do is the computer name. So I'm going to click OK. And it tells me I have to restart the computer in order for this change to take place, so I'll click OK. I'm going to close this window. And I'm going to go ahead and restart now. So now the computer will go ahead and shut down and it will reboot. And this will take just a few moments. But when it's done rebooting, what's going to happen is it's going to bring us right back into the initial configuration task utility. And the reason why, and I didn't show you this, I'll show you in just a moment when it comes back up, is because there is a checkbox that you need to check that says don't open this utility anymore when I log into the computer. Okay, in other words, they made this smart enough to say, all right, they want to go ahead and use this utility for all the initial configuration tasks, which might include a reboot. So let's go ahead and have it keep popping up until the user tells me that I'm done with this utility. So you'll see here it has rebooted. It's asking us to press Control-Alt-Delete to log in, so I'll press Control-Alt-Delete. Administrator, need to put in my secret secure password and hit Enter or click this little arrow here. And again, it's going to take us into the desktop. And now we have our desktop, and once again, the initial configuration task utility should open. So let's wait here just a moment. And there we go. Takes us right back into this utility. By the way, that checkbox that I was referring to is right here. Do not show this window at logon. And I don't want to check that yet. You only want to check that once you know you are done with this utility. Now the next step here is to choose whether you want to enable automatic updating and feedback. So I'm going to click on that link, and you'll see here, do we want to enable automatic updating and feedback, or do we want to manually configure our settings? You'll see this is always the recommended way of doing things. See, it says recommended, and it has the shield with the green shield with the check mark. But if you don't automatically just want to turn this all on, you could click manually configure settings and choose whether you want to participate in this or not. We do want to have automatic updates enabled, so I'm going to click the link saying, yeah, go ahead and do this. So now you'll see here it says install updates automatically using Windows Update, and Windows Error Reporting is on. The one thing I could have done is I could have said, no, don't participate in error reporting, because this is just a test environment. This is not an actual production environment. So I may have chosen to opt out of it, because you could kind of skew the numbers with Microsoft if you were to send them information that's subject to something that's not very real. But I know that most of what we're going to do here, if there's an error that happens, well, that's an error that we would see in a production environment. So I figure go ahead and send those errors to Microsoft. Let them know about it. Now the next step here is to download and install updates. You'll see here it's never happened. So I'm going to click the link and hope that when I set up networking, I didn't ruin my internet access. So I'm going to click the link. And you'll see here that apparently it's already gone out, and it has looked and recognized that there are 25 important updates and 14 optional updates that are available. Now I could go ahead and I could click on these links and I could see what these updates are. But I've already looked at these in the past. Plus, this is a clean installation, and I know that all the latest and greatest stuff is exactly what I want. There's nothing that Microsoft has put out in the way of an update that I don't, that I explicitly don't want to have. So I'm going to go ahead and just install updates. And you'll see here for one of the updates, the Windows Malicious Software Removal Tool, I need to accept the terms, so I'll accept them and click Finish. And you'll see here that it's going to go through a process of downloading and installing these updates. Now, depending on exactly when you are doing this on your end, there may be more or less than 25 updates. There may be more or less than 76.5 megabytes that need to be downloaded. Your internet bandwidth may be faster or slower than mine. And the point is that this might take a little while. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to once again pause the recording of this lesson. And if you're following along, please go ahead and pause the lesson as well. And just as we did before, I will resume when these updates are downloaded and installed and we are being prompted to move along to the next step. So I'll see you in just a moment. Okay, so you'll see here that a few minutes have passed, the updates were successfully installed, but a restart is required. So I'm going to go ahead and click Restart Now. And then again, this will take just a few moments while the system shuts down. And this will take actually just a little bit longer than the previous reboot, because you can see here as part of the Windows Update process, completing these updates during the reboot. Okay, so it takes a few extra moments, but as you can see, it's still going by very quickly. It's already rebooting, and you'll also see that in just a moment when it comes back up, it's going to again continue the installation. So it takes just a few extra minutes. Now, again, on your end, just so that you can relate with what's going on, the timing may not be the same as what you see here, depending on the speed of your computer, but then also depending on the number of updates that you have and the size of those updates relative to what I have here. Okay, so this should take, on my end, just another few moments to go ahead and get the desktop back up. And remember, once the desktop comes back up, what's it going to do? It's going to take us into the initial configuration task utility, because I haven't checked that box yet. And the reason I haven't checked that box, well, it's because we haven't finished all the tasks. So here you'll see it wants me to press Control-Alt-Delete, so I'll do that. Enter my password, hit enter, takes us into the desktop and to our initial configuration task utility. Now, although we're not quite done yet, we are close. Okay, we are close because we only have a couple of extra things left to do to get this computer completely ready to have Active Directory installed. You'll see here that we've already activated Windows, we've set up our time zone, we configured networking, we set up the computer name, there is no domain needed, we enabled automatic updates, and we've now downloaded and installed all the latest and greatest updates. If I scroll this window down, you'll see that there's more. It's kind of like one of those old infomercials. But wait, there's more. Here we have the ability to add roles. Now, this is one of the steps that I skipped when I gave you the original steps that we were going to go through. And the reason why is because we're going to add a role, but we're going to do that through a different utility. Okay, we're not going to add any roles right now. Same thing with features. We're not going to add any additional features right now. What we are going to do is we're going to enable remote desktop and configure Windows Firewall. So I'm going to say enable remote desktop. And we're going to talk about this in more detail in the next lesson. But for right now, I'm just going to go ahead and say allow connections. Oh, by the way, this window that just popped up, I know it kind of popped up and went away quickly, but that was just a window that pops up telling you that Windows Update had installed updates and rebooted the computer. You'll always see that. That's kind of there so that typically when you come in the morning and you log in, it's saying, hey, just so you know, I rebooted overnight and installed some updates. You may want to look and see what I've installed. Okay, that's what that balloon was. But anyway, back to here with the remote desktop. By default, we're not allowing any remote desktop connections to this computer. But we're going to want to be able to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and allow connections from computers running any version of remote desktop. Now here, it just opens up a dialog box letting you know that a Windows Firewall exception, well, it says remote desktop firewall, but it's in Windows Firewall. An exception has been made for remote desktop so that these connections can come in. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. I do want to point out real quickly that I could have chosen to allow connections from computers running remote desktop only with NLA, network level authentication, which is more secure, and we're going to talk about that in the next lesson. But for right now, I want to be able to connect to this computer from any of my computers, which includes potentially a Windows XP computer. You may remember that they have out in the Dallas office. Okay, so that's why I'm saying any version of remote desktop. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And then here we have Windows Firewall. If I click that, you'll see here that Windows Firewall is on, and that's fine. That's what we want it to be. We have our green shields with the check mark. So although I selected to configure it, it's already been configured. It's already on. So I can go ahead and close that window. And then guess what? That takes me to the bottom of the initial configuration task utility, and that means I can check the box that says don't bother me with this anymore, because I've done it. I've gone through this entire list. So I'm going to check the box and close this window. When I close this window, guess what? Another utility is going to open. By default, the Server Manager is going to open on all Windows Server 2008 computers unless you check the box that says don't open this by default. And although we are going to use the server manager throughout a lot of this course, I'm going to actually check this box saying don't bother me with this. I will open the server manager manually when I need it. So I'm going to go ahead and check that box and close the server manager. And now I get a blank desktop. Now the only other thing that you may want to do, and this is optional, you can choose to do this if you want, and that would be if you want to set up a screen resolution or any kind of a desktop wallpaper, background, or any other visual settings. You could just right click on the desktop, and here, see, I can go to my screen resolution. Right now it defaults to 800 by 600. That's generally, by today's standards, smaller than what we want to use. So for instance, I could go ahead and I could change this to 1024 by 768 and click OK. And you'll see the screen will shift here. I'll say I want to go ahead and keep these changes. And you don't really notice anything dramatic change other than the fact that now icons are a little bit smaller. You can fit a little bit more into the actual screen. All right, so we have completed the installation of the operating system. Let's go back and talk about installing the Forest root. Okay, well, similar to what we did with installing the operating system, all I have on the screen for you here are the tasks involved with installing the Forest root domain controller. Now, technically, there could be a task that precedes all of these tasks, which says install Windows Server 2008 R2. Okay, but we've just gone through that. So we're going to assume we're at that point, and what do we need to do? Well, task 1, we're going to add the Active Directory domain services role. You may remember that just a moment ago there were roles and features that we could have added, and we chose to skip that, and that's because we're going to add it now manually. In a production environment, there is really nothing wrong if you wanted to go ahead and do it as part of the initial configuration task utility. There's nothing wrong with that at all. I just knew that we were going to want to come back to it, so I went ahead and skipped that step. So once we add that role, which will install the Active Directory domain services binaries, as they're called, we then need to run a utility called DC Promo. You will see, and when we go through this, that there's a nifty little link that they give us at the conclusion of installing ADDS saying, hey, look, click this link to run DC Promo and configure Active Directory now that it's been installed. So we're going to run DC Promo, and in that utility, we are then going to, it's just a wizard. And what I have listed on the screen here is all the different things that we will do in that wizard. We will select that we want to create a new domain in a new forest. We will assign a DNS name to that domain. We will select our forest and domain functional levels. We talked about that in a previous lesson. We will choose to add DNS and global catalog server to this installation of Active Directory, and this is actually why you might remember that I set up DNS to point to my router, and I said that's going to change. Well, when I choose to add DNS to this domain controller, it's also then going to need to point to itself as its own DNS server for support. We will need to give a location for the database, the actual Active Directory database, and the sysvol share. We will need to assign a directory services restore mode administrator password. Okay, so that's what the DSRM stands for, is directory services restore mode. That is, again, something we'll talk about in a later lesson in this course. We will then check a box to reboot upon completion, because basically at this point we sit back and relax and watch it do its thing, and then again at the end it needs to reboot, so I'm going to check the box saying, yeah, go ahead and reboot when you're done. Otherwise, if you don't check that box, it finishes and then you have to click reboot. I don't ever see much of the need in doing that, other than if you feel more comfortable in the confidence that you've seen it complete before rebooting. Now, after we install this Forest root domain controller, we need to verify this installation. And I will tell you that this is an extremely important step that is very often skipped. Okay? I suppose it becomes less and less important as you install more and more domain controllers in your enterprise. But for the forest root domain controller, the one that begins everything that is Active Directory, you need to make sure it truly installed. And I will tell you that I have firsthand experience of somebody who went in, installed Active Directory, thought that it had installed just fine, went forward and began installing additional domain controllers and doing other things, only to find out that the original domain controller had not installed correctly and had a lot of work to do as a result of that not verifying, which you'll see when we verify. This takes, like 1 minute. I mean, all we need to do is open up Active Directory users and computers, which is a utility, just to see that the utility has been installed, and you can navigate and look at the different objects in Active Directory. We'll look for the presence of a file called ntds.dit, which is the actual database file. We'll verify the creation of the sysvol share, which, by the way, this sysvol share is what is used for replication between domain controllers. And then we'll look for the presence of the SRV resource records in the DNS database. All right, well, let's go ahead and pop back over to New York DC1 and install Active Directory. Okay, so here we are back on our computer that we named New York DC1, right? Technically, it's not a domain controller yet. And, well, that's what we're going to go do now. Now, the utility that we want to use to add the Active Directory Domain Services role is the Server Manager. That's the utility where we add roles. That's also the utility that opens by default every time we log in if we don't check that box saying to go away, but we did check the box. So how do we get back to it? Well, there's a number of different ways to get into the Server Manager. I'm going to show you two primary ways to do it. One would be to click this icon right down here on the taskbar. This is here by default, and you'll see here just by hovering my cursor over it, it says it's the Server Manager. Another way we could do it is by clicking Start, going to Administrative Tools, and then here we find the Server Manager. Before I click on Server Manager, I want you to notice there are no tools here that say Active Directory anything. Okay, we don't have any Active Directory tools yet. The reason I want you to notice that is because there will be tools after installing Active Directory, and that's part of that verification process. So I'm going to click on Server Manager, and I'll go ahead and expand this to the full screen. In the Server Manager, I'm going to click on Roles, and it's going to go through here and look and see how many roles we currently have. And we have 0. Well, that's not a surprise. We just installed the operating system. We haven't done anything yet. And then we click on Add Roles. And this takes you into the Add Roles wizard. Now, the very first screen we get is an optional screen. You'll see here we can skip this page by default, and I am going to check that box. Let's look at it right now, but then I don't want to ever see it again. Basically, what this screen is telling us is that before you install any of these significant server roles, you should have an administrator account with a strong password. And I told you I went ahead and put in my secure, strong password. You should have network settings all configured, and it's recommending here, such as a static IP address. Okay, remember, we put in a static IP because anything of significance, you don't want it to be a moving target. Okay, so we've already done that. And the latest security updates are installed. Well, we went through and did that. So since we know that we have taken care of these preliminary steps, I don't need to be bothered by this page anymore in the future. So I'm going to click Next. And here you'll see there's a list of server roles. The role that we want to install is Active Directory Domain Services. And as soon as I check that box, you'll notice I get interrupted here with another box telling me that I can't install this particular role unless other features are installed. And I will tell you that in general, when you get this message, in general, Microsoft is really good about this. Matter of fact, I can't think of a single time that I've had this box come up and I haven't just gone ahead and said, add the required features. Just go ahead and do it. Okay, Microsoft's real good about saying, all right, in order to do A, you have to do B. All right, well, go ahead and do B. I mean, you want to take at least a quick look at what's on that screen in case there's something that you know to be a problem that will interfere with something on one of your systems. But otherwise, it's a requirement anyway, so you might as well just go ahead and do it. But anyway, you'll see here that the box is checked for Active Directory domain services. Before I go forward, I want to point out something that we talked about a couple lessons ago, where Active Directory is technically made up of 5 different services now. This course is going to be focused on Active Directory domain services. This is what we previously knew as basically being an Active Directory, but now we have 4 other components, which are Active Directory Certificate Services, Federation Services, Lightweight Directory Services, and Rights Management Services, which we don't need to check those boxes right now because we're going to do those much later in this course. I have a lesson on each one of those individually. So I'm going to go ahead and check that one box and click Next. Here, it just gives you kind of an overview as to what you're about to do. It tells you what Active Directory Domain Services is. You'll notice here it says after you install this role, you're going to have to use the Active Directory Domain Services Installation Wizard, or DC Promo, which we were talking about. Okay, so just an overview. I'm going to click Next. And then we have a confirmation of what are we about to install, Active Directory Domain Services, and then the additional .NET Framework features that are required to go with it. I'm going to click Install. And now we get to look at a bar going across the screen. And as I've already done a couple times in this lesson, rather than bore you with looking at a bar going across the screen or telling you random jokes to see if I can get you to laugh, I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording. And again, if you're following along, you should pause it as well. And I will be back with you as soon as this process is complete. Okay, a few moments has passed, and you will see here that both Active Directory Domain Services as well as the .NET Framework, in both cases, installation has succeeded. I will tell you that typically when you install a role, at this point you would just go ahead and click Close, because you're done. The role is installed. And in this case, well, we could do that. We could click Close. The role is installed. But the problem is it hasn't been configured. You have to run DC Promo. Now we can do DC Promo manually, or we could just click this nifty little link they have here that says close this wizard, so it's doing the close box for you, and launch the Active Directory Domain Services Installation Wizard DC Promo. So I'm going to go ahead and click that now, and you'll see here that that box closes, right? That first wizard closes, and a new wizard has opened. So here is the welcome screen to the Active Directory Domain Services Installation Wizard. The only thing we have on this screen is the choice to do Advanced Mode Installation, which we're not going to talk about right now and we're not going to worry about. Okay, we're going to do a standard installation, nothing fancy. So I'm going to go ahead and click Next. Here is just a warning box that tells you about operating system compatibility. Okay, it's just telling you about certain security features that we now have and where older operating systems may not support those features. So I'll go ahead and click Next. And this is where we need to go ahead and say we're going to create a new domain in a new forest. And if you did print out the instructions I had before, you may remember that that is the first thing basically that I said we're going to do here is select to create a new domain in a new forest. Click Next. Now we need to go ahead and assign a DNS name, or an FQDN, a fully qualified domain name. And we had said that this name was going to be globalmantics.local. So I'll go ahead and type that in and click Next. Here it's looking to see if this name is already in use, because that would be a problem. If on this network we already have a globalmantics.local, well, the name resolution is going to be a problem because we're not going to know how to resolve that. So this should just take a brief moment because I don't believe I have globalmantics.local running on my network. And now you'll see that it's verifying the NetBIOS name. Now this is an older, shorter version of the name, which, by the way, the NetBIOS name for globalmantics.local, it'll be just the first 15 characters, which is just globalmantics. And if you're thinking to yourself, hey, wait a minute, Ed, globalmantics is only 12 characters. it won't include the suffix. It won't include the .local. The reason I say it includes the first 15 characters is if the name was longer than Global Mantix. So maybe I say Global Mantix Corporation.local. Then it would just be Global Mantix COR, and it would cut off there at the 15th character. That's the rules behind NetBIOS names. They can only be 15 characters long. Here's where we now need to select our forest functional level. You'll see here that we get to choose between Windows 2000, Windows Server 2003, Windows Server 2008, and Windows Server 2008 R2. Now, you may recall that I had mentioned in a previous lesson that all we had was Server 2003 and 2008. We actually have Windows 2000 as well, but we also have Windows Server 2008 R2. And this is all because of the changes that were made in Windows Server 2008 R2. Obviously, that selection could not have been there if we were still just running Windows Server 2008 because, well, that version hasn't even heard of R2. Now, the one thing I want to re-emphasize is that if we are going to select Windows Server 2008 R2, which, by the way, that is what I'm going to select, all domain controllers in this forest must be Windows Server 2008 R2. Okay, it says right here, you'll only be able to add domain controllers that are running Windows Server 2008 R2 or later to this forest. That's okay for this situation because that's all I'm going to be adding. In a production environment, if you still had domain controllers, and those are the only servers that matter, that are going to be running previous versions of Windows, then you would have to select the functional level that supports those previous versions. The reason I want to select Windows Server 2008 R2 is because in this course, I want to be able to show you all the latest and greatest features. I don't want to be hindered and have certain features disabled because we're using a functional level that supports previous operating systems. So I'm going to go ahead and click Next. And you'll see here that it's going to jump right into examining the DNS configuration. I didn't have to select anything as far as the domain functional level because if I'm going to go with Windows Server 2008 R2 Forest functional level, by default, all domain functional levels will be Windows Server 2008 R2 as well. Now, as far as examining the DNS configuration, what it's doing is it's looking at the DNS server that I'm currently pointed to see if it supports SRV resource records. Okay, and regardless of whether my router does or does not, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do what it recommends. It recommends that you install the DNS server service on the first domain controller. Microsoft recommends that you use Microsoft DNS to support Windows Active Directory. And I have to say, I agree. I'm not against using any other DNS infrastructure that's out there, but if it's going to be Microsoft Windows Active Directory, then I am a big believer in at least on your forest route setting up a Microsoft Windows DNS server as well to support it. They just get along. They get along real well. So I'm going to go ahead and check the box saying I do want to be a DNS server. See, I could uncheck that box, and then I would have to rely on my router for DNS. And, well, in this case, I think that's okay because I didn't get any kind of a warning saying, well, your DNS server doesn't support SRV resource records. But I do want to become a DNS server, and then I'm going to use myself for DNS. Now, there are two other choices here on this screen, both of which are grayed out. One is to be a global catalog server, and, well, that you have to do. And the reason why is because you must have at least one global catalog server on your network when it comes to Active Directory. And since this is the only domain controller right now, well, it needs to be a global catalog server. Likewise, the read-only domain controller, which is something we're going to talk about in a future lesson, you cannot do. It's grayed out and it's not checked. And the reason why is because in order to become a read-only domain controller, you can't be the first. You have to have another read-write domain controller out there to replicate your information from. Okay, and it says that right here, by the way. The first domain controller must be global catalog server and cannot be an RODC. So it's telling you exactly what I just explained as far as why these are grayed out. So we're going to be a DNS server and a global catalog server. I'm going to click next. And again, it's going to go through and examine DNS. Basically what it's doing is it's looking at how you're currently configured and looking at what kind of changes you need to make to support the configuration that you are selecting. Now you'll see here that we get a warning box, and this comes up every time. Okay, when you are creating your forest root domain, especially if you're using a name that is not valid on the internet, you will see here that it says a delegation for this DNS server cannot be created because the authoritative parent zone cannot be found or it does not run on a Windows DNS server. Okay? Every time when you're creating the forest root, unless you have some kind of weird situation where you actually have a Windows DNS server that is already authoritative for the .local, because that would be the parent, by the way, the .local zone, you're going to get this message. So this is not something you need to worry about. This is something you can say, okay, I'm familiar with this. I understand why it's happening. I'm going to go ahead and say, yes, I want to continue. Next, I need to select a location for my database. And this, by the way, is where we're going to go to look for ntds.dit when we're done installing that file that actually is the database. We have our logs, because with any database, you always have logs. And then we have our sys file share. If we had multiple hard drives, we may want to separate the database from the log files. That is something that is recommended for performance, but only if you have different physical drives. If you have one physical hard drive and you divide into a C partition and a D partition, you are not doing yourself a favor by separating them into separate partitions. And the reason why is because the database wants to be accessed simultaneously as being able to write to the log files in order to improve performance. Well, you can do that if you have separate physical disks. You cannot do that if it's the same disk, the same read-write head, just going to different partitions. Okay? So since I only have one disk and one partition, I'm going to leave the defaults. The defaults are perfectly acceptable. I'm going to go ahead and click on Next. Now I need to put in the Directory Services Restore Mode Administrator password. So I'm going to put in a secure password for that. Now we're not going to do anything with Directory Services Restore Mode till later in the course, but we have to have the password in place for when we do go there. So I'm going to click Next. And here's a summary of everything we're about to do. Now I could export these settings, and you'll see that this would create what's called an answer file for use with unattended installations of other domain controllers if I wanted to do this exact same process. Now obviously this would not be a good example of where we want to do that because this is the only forest root, right? There's only one forest root. If we were creating replicas, we may want to do that. But we don't need to worry about answer files or anything like that for right now. I'm just going to go ahead and click on Next. And this is where we now go through, and you'll see it's got the little book here, and the pencil's writing information in the book, right? It's creating the database. And this is where we're going to check the box saying, yeah, when you're done, reboot. If I don't check that box, you know what's going to happen? It's going to say, all right, I'm done. Click here to reboot. If that makes you feel more comfortable, that's perfectly acceptable. But in my case, I'm good with it. I want you to go ahead and reboot on your own when you're done. So this is where we get to sit back and relax. And of course, what does that mean? That means I'm going to pause the recording. And if you're following along, you're going to pause the lesson as well. And I will be right back with you as soon as this is complete and the system has rebooted. Alrighty, Active Directory has completed installing, and we've rebooted, and now it's asking us to press Control-Delete, so I'll do that now. And now I just want you to notice one thing before we finish logging in, and that is that it's now saying the Global Mantix Administrator, as opposed to before it just said Administrator. Okay, there is no longer a local administrator account, and that's because domain controllers don't have local administrator accounts. They're a domain controller. There's nothing local about them. So it's now the domain administrator account that we log on when we log into the domain controller from now on. So I'm going to go ahead, and the password hasn't changed. It takes on the same password that we had as the local administrator. So I'll go ahead and use that and log in here. Now it'll take just a moment, and it may actually even take an extra moment to bring up the desktop. And the reason why is because, well, technically it's a new account, so to speak. It's a domain administrator account as opposed to the local administrator account, and so there's a new profile created for that particular user. But I don't want to confuse you. That's a whole separate lesson talking about user profiles. So anyway, here you'll see that we now are back on the desktop. And what I'm going to do now that we're back on the desktop is, well, we need to verify the installation of Active Directory. Now, one thing that I didn't mention that we were going to do, and I'm going to do this first, is I'm going to click on Server Manager. I had mentioned that we were going to go right into Active Directory users and computers, but I want to go into the Server Manager, and I'm going to click on Roles. I guess the very first thing I would want to do to verify is, well, I want to see that the Active Directory Domain Services role is installed, and it is. As a matter of fact, you'll notice there's 2 roles installed. The DNS server role has also installed, right? Because we chose to install DNS as well as Active Directory Domain Services. So let me go ahead and close out of the Server Manager now that we verified that the role is installed. And now we can go through the other 4 steps that I said we could do to verify this installation. First thing is click on Start, go to our administrative tools, and you'll notice there's all kinds of Active Directory utilities now on our administrative tools list. And the one that I want to go to in particular is Active Directory users and computers. This is the primary utility that we would use when navigating through Active Directory and working with the Active Directory objects. So here you'll see globalmantics.local. If I expand that, you'll see that we have some containers. If I click on users, you'll see we have our built-in groups, and then we have administrator and guest. Okay, I could go through and look at the rest of this. I click on domain controllers, and you'll see there's our New York DC1 2K8. Right, that's our domain controller computer account. If I click on computers, you'll see it's blank because the only computer account in this domain is the domain controller, and it's going to go into the domain controllers container. But anyway, I don't want to worry you with any of this. We'll talk about the structure and all that as we go through the different lessons. Right now, I just want you to verify and say, all right, stuff's there. That's great. So I'm going to close this window. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Start. And in the Search Programs and Files box right here, I'm just going to go ahead and type in C:\Windows\NTDS. Okay, here we have NTDS. And the reason I went to that folder is because you may remember that that's where we said we wanted our database and log files. And sure enough, there's the ntds.dit file. That is the actual database. So guess what? Right now, the database is only about 18 megabytes in size. Okay, it's pretty small. So we're fitting on our 80 gig hard drive without any difficulty at all. But as we add stuff, of course, this file will grow. Now the next thing we want to check on is the sysvol share. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and close this window. I'm going to click Start, and then again in the Search Programs and Files window, I'm going to put in // and I'm going to put in globalmantics.local / and I don't even need to type anything else because right here you'll see that it populates to sysvol, meaning that is one of the shares that are available. Okay, this is the name of the domain, and then here's the sysvol share, and if I click on it, you'll see there's globalmantics.local inside the sysvol share. Again, don't worry about the details behind what you see here. It's just a matter of verifying that the sysvol share exists and is accessible, because without this, you can't replicate between domain controllers. And by the way, when I mentioned that I have firsthand knowledge of a company where somebody went in and they went ahead and they installed that first domain controller and they thought, everything was great, but it actually wasn't. And I should, as a side note, by the way, it wasn't me. I'd admit it if it was me. I've made plenty of ridiculous mistakes over the years. In this case, it wasn't me. It was actually a job I refused to take. and one of my students took the job, and that student didn't pay attention to this one small detail. And because the sysvol share actually did not get created and was not accessible, when all the additional domain controllers were created, they couldn't replicate in the domain. Okay, so this is a very important step. So it is there, so we're good to go. So I'm going to go ahead and close this window. And the last thing we want to do is click on Start, go to our administrative tools, and select DNS, another new utility that was created when we installed the role. In here, let me go ahead and open up this window. Here's our DNS server, New York DC1. Expand that. Here's our forward lookup zones. And here you see this underscore msdcs.globalmantics.local. And inside of there, you'll see we have a bunch of records. Those are the SRV resource records. The way you can recognize them is that they will have these underscore MSDCS designation. Okay, so that means we have our resource records, which means Active Directory is recognizable to DNS. So we can go ahead and close that. And we have indeed now verified that Active Directory was successfully installed. Now, one last thing I want to do before we leave here is I want to go ahead and look at our networking properties. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Start. And here we have Network. So I'm going to right click and go to Properties. And I'm going to go to Change Adapter Settings. Here's our local area connection. Right click, Properties. Highlight IP version 4, Properties. I want you to notice that the preferred DNS server is no longer the router. The preferred DNS server is now 127.0.0.1, which is an IP address which represents local host, or another way of saying is this points to myself for DNS. And to simplify this, just to make sure there's no confusion, I'm going to actually change this to 192.168.10.201, where I'm actually pointing to my own IP address. I will tell you that if you ever worked with Windows Server 2003, back in the early days when the operating system was first created, this was actually a known bug, that if you didn't change this IP address to your actual IP address, if it had the loopback address, you actually had problems. So it's kind of an old habit of mine that I always change it to the IP address, although technically you didn't have to do anything. It all would have worked just fine. They've worked those bugs out many, many years ago. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK and close, and then go ahead and close this window. And guess what? We've installed the forest root. So now let's go ahead and talk about installing a replica domain controller. When it comes to installing a replica domain controller, guess what? The steps are going to be almost identical. Okay, step 1 is install Windows Server 2008 R2. Right, we have to install the operating system on another computer. Step 2, add the Active Directory domain services role, just like we did before. Step 3, run DC promo, just like we did before. And by the way, you'll notice that the install Windows Server 2008 R2, I didn't break that down into all the individual steps. Just do the exact same thing we did the first time. When it comes to DC promo, I did list the steps for you though, because they change a little bit. Instead of choosing to create a new domain in a new forest, because this is a replica domain controller, we're going to select to join an existing forest. And then we're going to be prompted with another screen where we can choose whether we want to add a domain controller to an existing domain or create a new domain. So we're going to go ahead and add a domain controller to an existing domain. We have to enter some network credentials, proving that we are an account that is allowed to be doing this within our Active Directory network. Select the domain that we're going to join or add an additional domain controller to. We then have to select a site, which is not something we had to do before. I'll talk about that when we get there. And actually, I can tell you that sites is something we'll talk about in an upcoming lesson later on in the course. But I'll talk about exactly what we're going to do right now with selecting a site when we get into the actual wizard. Again, we're going to choose to add DNS and global catalog server. We're going to pick a location for the database and sysvol share, assign a DSRM administrator password, and check the box for rebooting upon completion. Sit back and relax, and then verify the installation. So as you can see, these steps are going to be very, very similar. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to take you over to another computer that I've already installed Windows Server 2008 R2, and I've already gone through the initial configuration task utility, and I've named this computer New York DC2. So we're going to actually start off where we install Active Directory. So on the assumption that if you're following along, you have not installed this second computer yet, go ahead and pause the lesson and then go ahead and resume once you have that computer installed. Okay, so here we are over on New York DC2, and what I've done here is I've left up the initial configuration task utility so that you can see that I've already gone through. I activated, set the time zone, Eastern time zone again. Most specifically, I wanted you to see under configuring networking, the IP address I entered was 192.168.10.202, okay, as opposed to 201, which was New York DC1. The other thing that I did, and I'll tell you what, let me go ahead and click on Configure Networking, right-click Local Area Connection, and go to Properties, highlight IP version 4 Properties. I want to also point out that instead of pointing to the router for DNS, I'm pointing to New York DC1 for DNS. Since we already have a DNS infrastructure set up for Global Mantics, I wanted to go ahead and point to that. It'll make the process of installing Active Directory and joining that domain, so to speak, and it's not really that we're joining the domain, it's that we're creating an additional domain controller in the domain. Well, that process will be easier if we're pointing to a DNS server that is recognized within that domain. So let me go ahead and cancel out of here, close all of this. So that's one change that I did when it comes to networking. For the computer name, you'll see it's New York DC2 instead of DC1. Still part of a work group. Some people believe that you need to join the domain before becoming a domain controller in the domain. That's just not true. That's just a wasted step. So I went ahead and left it as a work group, and I suppose I should clarify. It's only a wasted step if you are doing this boom, boom, boom the way I'm doing it. There are very often times that you will create computers that will be member servers within the domain, and then therefore you do want to join the domain, and then they become domain controllers later. So if it makes you feel more comfortable, you could go in here and you could join the domain. And that's a process, by the way, that we're going to take a look at in more detail in the next lesson. But it's not a required step for what we're doing here. I went ahead and enabled updating and feedback, downloaded and installed the updates, enabled remote desktop, and configured Windows Firewall. I'm going to go ahead and check the box saying don't show me this anymore at Windows Logon. So close this window. And of course, the next window that's going to open up is going to be our server manager, which once again, I don't want to be bothered with this at logon. But as long as I'm in this window, let's go ahead and click on roles. You'll see none are installed, so I'll click add roles. Again, now you may be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, I thought we checked the box saying don't show me this page by default. We did, but that was on New York DC1. Now we're on New York DC2, so I have to once again see this window at least once and then skip the page from now on. So I'll click next, choose to install Active Directory Domain Services. Of course, it wants the .NET framework as well, so add required feature. Click next. Here's our introduction screen into what Active Directory Domain Services is. Click next. Our summary screen confirming what we're about to do. Click install. And now it's going to take just a few moments while we go through and install Active Directory Domain Services and .NET Framework 3.5.1 features. Now again, while this is installing, and it takes just a moment, I want to just review the fact that all I've done is installed Windows Server 2008 with the exact same configuration. And as a matter of fact, this computer is identical. It's another virtual machine, and it's exactly identical. Okay, it has 1 gig of RAM. It has an 80 gig hard drive. I booted off the same DVD for the operating system. Networking has been set up to be bridged so that I have external networking and can talk with the other virtual machines and the host and the internet, etc., etc. So here you'll see the installation is complete. I'm going to click the link to close this wizard and launch the Active Directory Domain Services Installation Wizard, otherwise known as DC Promo. So I'll go ahead and click this. That wizard closes, new one opens. Here's my welcome screen, click Next. Here's my little warning about operating system compatibility. We've seen that before, click Next. Here's where we begin to change from what we did last time. Last time we said we wanted to create a new domain in a new forest. Now we want to select an existing forest, and then we have two choices. I could either create a new domain in an existing forest, or I could add a domain controller to an existing domain, and that's what we want to do right now. So let's go ahead and click Next. Now it says type the name of any domain in the forest where you plan to install the domain controller. Okay, this is for any domain in the forest. Now we only have one, right? So globomantics.local. And here it says specify the account credentials to use to perform the installation. Now I have to say, as much as I told you that joining the domain is a step that's wasted, it doesn't affect anything, it actually affects this one step. And it's not a big deal, but right now you could use your current logged on credentials if I had already joined the domain and was logged on as the domain administrator. But because I'm not part of the domain and I'm logged on as a local administrator, I have to use alternate credentials. So I'm going to go ahead and click Set. And I'm going to put in administrator and the password. Now this has to be the administrator and password for globomantics.local. So I'll click OK. And you'll see here it does the globomantics.local /administrator account. Click Next. And now what it flashed on the screen is that it was enumerating domains. It was looking at all the different domains that are part of this forest. Okay, the previous screen said, pick any domain in the forest, just so I know where we're looking. Well, now it actually went through and it analyzed the forest based upon my credentials, and it's now telling me, all right, well, this is the one domain that's available. If we had more domains available, more domains, more trees, etc., I would see them listed here, and then this is where I would actually select the domain that I'm truly going to create a domain controller for. Again, only one choice, globomantics.local. Click Next. It goes through and it examines, make sure that I have the credentials and everything's okay, and it was. And this is where I need to select a site. Now, I'm not going to go into any great detail here about sites. We have a whole lesson that's going to be coming up later on here in the course where we talk about sites for different locations and replication and all kinds of fun stuff. But I will tell you that there is one site that is created by default when you create Active Directory. And you know what? The name of that site is pretty much what I just said. It's default first site name. That is the name of that default first site that gets created. There are no other sites. We haven't done anything with sites yet, so there's no site to choose from other than that default first site. So I'm going to kind of end it at that. We're not going to discuss why. We're just going to join that same site, which, by the way, that site does represent New York. And later on when we deal with sites, we're actually going to change the name of this site probably to New York. But for right now, just leave it highlighted and click Next. And again, it verified DNS. Now, it's currently pointing to New York DC1 for DNS, and that means everything's fine. Okay, no errors or anything occurred. And you'll see here it says there's currently one DNS server that's registered as authoritative for this domain. So I could clear that box, and that would be perfectly fine. Matter of fact, there's also a global catalog already on the network, so I could clear that box. You'll notice we could be a read-only domain controller. But that's something we're going to talk about in an upcoming lesson. What I want to do here, because this is supposed to be as close as possible to an exact replica to the first domain controller in this particular domain, which is the forest root domain, we want to go ahead and say that we want to be both a DNS server and a global catalog server. Okay, because we want to be as much of a duplicate as possible to that first domain controller. So I click Next, and it goes through and examines the DNS configuration, and it's going to realize that everything's fine. Basically what it's looking at is looking at who I'm currently pointed to. Here again, we get that warning box that we know we're going to get because there is no DNS server for the .local domain. It doesn't exist. So we don't care about the delegation. So we click Yes. We're going to take our default locations for our database log files and sys file share. Click Next. Put in our DSRM administrator password. Click Next. Here's a summary. Click Next. We're going to check the box saying reboot on your own when you're done. And you'll see here that it's installing DNS. And then it's going ahead and it's installing all the aspects of Active Directory. There's only one last thing I want to point out before I pause this recording and let this thing finish. And that is that you'll notice that the icon representing what it's doing is a little bit different. It now, instead of just creating a new database on a single server, it's showing that it's replicating what already exists. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording, let this thing finish installing, and I'll resume as soon as it's done and has rebooted. Okay, the installation has completed. It has rebooted. It now wants us to log in. So let's go ahead and do that. And again, you'll notice it's logging on as the Global Mantics administrator because we're now a domain controller. So there is no local administrator anymore. So in just a moment, it will bring us to our desktop. And pretty much all we have left to do is to verify that the installation is complete. And how do we do this? Well, we do this the same way we did it with the first domain controller. We go over here and we go to the server manager. And once in the server manager, we go ahead and click on roles. Here you'll see that 2 roles have been installed, Active Directory Domain Services, DNS. Okay, that's what we want to see. Close that. Oh, you know what? Server Manager opened up again on its own because I got to check that box saying don't show this at logon. So that's why I closed it and it was open already in the background. So close that. Click Start, Administrative Tools. Here's all our Active Directory tools, specifically Active Directory users and computers. And we can see it's here, and if I expand it, I can see the structure, so that's good. Close that. Click Start. Type in c:/windows/ntds. And in that directory, we can find our ntds.dit file, so the database does exist. Close that. Click Start. /globomantics.local / and then here, of course, is sysfile. So the share is there. We can access it. And then the last thing would be to go to DNS and verify on New York DC2. Under forward lookup zones, here's our _MSDCS, which is our SRV resource records. And to be more specific than what we did last time, I want to actually look here and see that I see entries for both New York DC1 and New York DC2. Okay, now if we really wanted to dig down deep, we could go into DC and TCP and again see that we have both New York DC1 and 2, but we don't need to go that deep. If you just highlight right here on the top level, you should be able to already see entries for both of those servers. So it all looks good. So the only thing I want to do, there's just one last thing that I want to do, and that is if I click on Start, right-click on Network and go to Properties, and then choose to change the adapter settings. Right-click on our local area connection, go to Properties. highlight IP version 4, go to Properties. I want you to see that the preferred DNS server is still New York DC1. And the reason that didn't change is because this time we were actually pointing to a DNS server that was truly authoritative for globalmantics.local. So what it did was it put in this loopback IP address as the alternate DNS server. So it actually looks to New York DC1 first, and then it looks to itself second. Well, that's not very efficient. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, no, let's look to ourselves first, right here. This is the IP address of New York DC2. Let's look to ourselves first, and then if for some reason I'm having an issue with DNS on my own box, on myself, then let's look to New York DC1. I'll click OK, close that window. Now if I were to switch over to New York DC1, which I'm going to do right now, okay, so now I've switched over. I know it looks pretty much the same. Still just the desktop. New York DC1 is this. You're going to have to trust me. That's the one I'm on. Again, I'm going to click on Start. Right-click Network. Go to Properties. You can already see right here, New York DC1. That's this computer. Change adapter settings. Right-click the local area connection. Properties. TCP/IP version 4. Properties. Besides pointing to myself for DNS, I'm going to go ahead and point to New York DC2 as my backup. Click OK. Close that window. And guess what? We have successfully set up our forest root domain with 2 domain controllers. So let's go ahead and take a look and review everything that we've done in this lesson. Okay, so in this lesson, we covered, well, first of all, we talked about the globalmantics scenario. And in the case of globalmantics, it was decided that we were going to go ahead and move forward with our Active Directory infrastructure using Windows Server 2008 R2. And that we wanted to go ahead and set up our forest root in the New York office, which is our corporate headquarters. And that the name of the Active Directory infrastructure would be globalmantics.local. So what did we do? We went ahead and installed Windows Server 2008 R2. Matter of fact, we installed it twice. Okay, we should now have 2 servers with Windows Server 2008 R2. We saw that it's really not that big a deal. Installation has come a long way, in my opinion, from the days when we used to have to go through lengthy wizards that you had to answer a lot of questions. Now, very few questions, installs very quickly. We installed the forest root domain controller, okay, the very first domain controller in the forest. And by the way, I should mention there are some other significances to that one box. When we get to a future lesson in this course where we talk about something called FSMOs, Flexible Single Master of Operations, you'll see that there is something that is still unique about this box from any other box in the forest. Okay, so I'll just kind of tease you with that, but we'll talk about that in detail in a later lesson. So we got that installed by installing the Active Directory Domain Services role and then going through the DC Promo Wizard. And then we followed that up by going ahead and installing a replica domain controller so that if something were to happen to the first domain controller, well, we would still be functioning because we have another domain controller to service our clients. All right, well, that's all I have for you in this lesson. I will see you in the next one.